Everyone remembers the Colt Peacemaker and the Winchester rifle, but those weren't the guns gamblers carried under the table. Some Wild West weapons were so small they could vanish in your palm. One even ended the life of a US president. In this countdown, we're looking at 15 concealed weapons that lawmen, outlaws, and riverboat gamblers used when things got ugly. Some were tucked in boots, hidden in sleeves, or disguised as walking sticks. They weren't built for showdowns in the street, they were built for survival when no one expected a shot to be fired. Stick with me because our number one entry wasn't rare or fancy. It was cheap, unpredictable, and so common that anyone in the West could be hiding one. And I want to hear from you. If you lived on the frontier, which one of these would you carry? Drop your answer in the comments. Let's get started. With number 15, a hidden gun so tiny, you could wear it on your finger. Number 15, ring guns. The deadly handshake. They were called ring guns, but collectors today sometimes call them the deadly handshake. At first glance, they passed for chunky silver jewelry, the kind of oversized band you might spot on a gambler's hand as he shuffled cards across a saloon table. But hidden inside that band was a miniature single-shot pistol, most often chambered in .22 caliber. By the late 1800s, ring pistol curios were being sold in Europe, and a handful found their way west. They were marketed as the ultimate in concealed protection, proof that firearms could be disguised as almost anything. No one won a street gunfight with one of these, but that wasn't the point. At close range, even a small caliber shot could kill or cripple. Imagine shaking hands with a stranger in a smoky saloon, and realizing too late that the ring on his finger was actually a loaded weapon aimed at your chest. That was their danger. Not accuracy, not firepower, pure surprise. A gambler could casually scratch his chin, wave a card across the table, or make a hand gesture. And in that instant, fire a hidden shot no one expected. Were they common on the frontier? Not at all. Surviving examples suggest they were rare, more curiosities than mass-market weapons. But their very existence shows how far gunsmiths pushed the idea of concealment. In a world where most men open-carried revolvers on their hips, the ring gun was a reminder that the smallest firearm might be the easiest to miss. Today, they're prized as collectors' oddities. But back then, they carried one chilling lesson. In the Wild West, the smallest gun wasn't the least dangerous. It was the easiest to overlook. Gimmick or last chance lifesaver? Tell me what you think in the comments. Because if you thought firing a bullet from a piece of jewelry was strange, number 14 took concealment even further with a revolver designed to vanish inside your pocket. Number 14, folding trigger derringers, the vanishing revolver. They were called folding trigger derringers, but some collectors today call them the vanishing revolver. At first glance, they looked like ordinary pocket pistols. But instead of a fixed trigger, they had a clever spring-loaded design. The trigger folded flat into the frame when not in use. This gave them two huge advantages. First, they could slip into a coat or vest pocket without snagging on fabric, unlike a standard revolver. Second, with the trigger tucked away, the pistol looked less like a gun and more like an oddly shaped piece of metal. Perfect for hiding in plain sight. Most were small caliber, .22 or .32. And many were made in the late 19th century by European and American manufacturers catering to the concealed carry market. They weren't military weapons. They weren't even outlaw favorites. Instead, they were gamblers' pistols, designed for a close-range shot when things went sour at the card table. Hollywood loves to show big iron six-shooters, but in reality, many men and women of the frontier carried these tiny pistols as a backup. They were cheap, easy to hide, and often dismissed as novelties. But at arm's length, they could be lethal. What makes them fascinating today is how common sense the design really was. The folding trigger solved one of the biggest problems of concealed carry, drawing quickly from a pocket without snagging. In that sense, they were decades ahead of their time. Most examples that survive today are ornate, nickel-plated curios, collected more for their clever design than their battlefield record. But they left behind an important reminder. In the Wild West, sometimes the smartest weapon wasn't the fastest or the biggest. It was the one you never saw coming. And if one hidden barrel was good, imagine what a gambler could do with four. Number 13 packed that kind of surprise, in a gun no bigger than your palm. Number 13, Sharp's 4-barrel derringer, the gambler's pocket shotgun. This was the Sharp's 4-barrel derringer, sometimes called the pocket shotgun. At first glance, it looked like a chunky block of metal with a grip attached. But inside were 4 fixed barrels, stacked 2 over 2, each chambered for 22 or 32 rimfire cartridges. Instead of a rotating cylinder, the gun used a unique firing system. a single hammer and firing pin that slid to strike a different barrel with each pull of the trigger. That meant 4 shots, one after another, from a pistol small enough to vanish inside a gambler's vest. The design was the brainchild of Christian Sharps, the same gunsmith famous for the big-bore Sharps rifles used by buffalo hunters. But this little derringer was built for a very different market. Gamblers, riverboat travelers, and townsfolk who wanted a backup gun they could rely on in close quarters. Sharps manufactured thousands of these in the mid to late 1800s, and they quickly earned a reputation as the perfect saloon companion. They weren't powerful. They weren't long range. But at card table distance, 4 quick shots gave you a fighting chance. Hollywood almost never shows them, but surviving examples prove they were popular. Many came with decorative grips, even pearl or ivory inlays, marketed to gentlemen who wanted style as well as protection. The Sharps 4-barrel derringer shows how concealment and firepower were always in tension on the frontier. It didn't have the intimidation factor of a Colt on your hip, but it didn't need to. Its strength was surprise. Collectors today call it the pocket shotgun, not because it fired like one, but because, in the palm of your hand, it delivered more firepower than almost any other concealed pistol of its time. 4 hidden shots might sound impressive, but some gunmakers thought even that wasn't enough. Number 12 crammed 6 barrels into a single pistol, and the results were as bizarre as they were deadly. Number 12, Ethan Allen Pepperbox, the revolver with too many barrels. This was the Ethan Allen Pepperbox, often nicknamed the revolver with too many barrels. Instead of a single barrel and a rotating cylinder, the Pepperbox design stacked multiple barrels. Sometimes 4, sometimes 6, and in rare cases even more, all bundled together like the chambers of a revolver turned inside out. Invented in the 1830s and produced well into the mid-19th century, Pepperboxes were among the first successful repeating handguns in America. Ethan Allen, a Massachusetts gunsmith, became the best-known maker, producing thousands of these pistols in .31 and .36 caliber. By the time of the Wild West, they were already a little outdated, but they were still carried, especially as backups, well into the 1860s and 70s. The Pepperbox worked by rotating the entire cluster of barrels with each pull of the trigger, aligning a fresh barrel with the hammer. It gave a frontier traveler multiple shots without the need to reload, but it came with a reputation: heavy, awkward, and sometimes dangerous to the shooter. A poorly timed mechanism could set off more than one barrel at once, a flaw that made the gun both feared and ridiculed. Despite those risks, Pepperboxes were popular because they offered what no other small handgun could at the time: repeating fire. Outlaws, settlers, and even some lawmen tucked them into coat pockets as a second weapon. They were never as elegant as the Colt revolver, but in a close-range fight, the Pepperbox could be devastating. Collectors today look at the Pepperbox as an evolutionary dead end, but it paved the way for true revolvers. And in the saloons of the frontier, its bulky, multi-barrel frame earned it a reputation as both a curiosity and a very real threat. But what if a concealed gun didn't look like a gun at all? Number 11 disguised itself as something no one would suspect: a gentleman's walking stick. Number 11, cane gun, the gentleman's secret. This was the cane gun, sometimes called the gentleman's secret. On the outside, it looked like an ordinary walking stick: polished wood, a metal tip, maybe even a carved handle. But hidden inside was a gun barrel, ready to fire at the press of a concealed trigger. Cane guns were especially popular in Europe during the Victorian era, where a gentleman might not want to be seen openly carrying a firearm. But they did make their way west, usually through imports or as personal items carried by wealthier settlers and travelers. To the untrained eye, they were just fashion accessories. In reality, they could fire a pistol round, or in some cases, even a shotgun shell. The appeal was obvious. You could walk down the street looking perfectly respectable while hiding a weapon in plain sight. For gamblers, businessmen, or lawmen going undercover, that concealment could be life-saving. But cane guns weren't without problems. They were slow to aim, awkward to reload, and legally questionable in many jurisdictions. Some towns in the West banned disguised weapons altogether, fearing they encouraged assassinations and ambushes. And for good reason. They were almost impossible to spot until the moment they went off. Hollywood rarely shows cane guns, but in real life they were part of a wider 19th century obsession with disguised firearms. Ring guns, knife pistols, and all sorts of odd inventions designed to make a weapon invisible until it was needed. Today, surviving cane guns are collector's items, prized for their craftsmanship and unusual design. But in the Wild West, they embodied one dangerous truth: The man leaning casually on his walking stick might not be unarmed at all. Disguised weapons like the cane gun were clever, but some men didn't want subtlety. Number 10 combined raw intimidation with brute force, turning a revolver into a weapon that doubled as a brawler's fist. Number 10, Dog's Head Knuckle Duster Revolver, the saloon brawler's gun. They called it the Dog's Head Knuckle Duster Revolver, though versions were made under different names. On one end, it was a small caliber revolver, usually 22 or 32 rimfire. But the grip doubled as a set of brass knuckles, sometimes decorated with the snarling face of a dog cast into the metal. It was the ultimate brawler's weapon. In a rowdy saloon, a man could throw a punch with the heavy brass grip, then follow it up by firing a shot at point-blank range. That combination made it both feared and infamous on the frontier. The design came from the late 19th century when firearms makers were experimenting with hybrid weapons. They were sold in large numbers, often cheaply, and became popular among gamblers, drifters, and anyone who wanted a little extra insurance in a barroom brawl. But while the idea sounds terrifying, in practice they were awkward. The revolvers were usually underpowered, and the knuckle grip was bulky to carry. Still, the psychological impact was real. If you saw a man draw one, you knew you were facing both a fist and a firearm. Hollywood rarely shows these hybrid weapons, but in the lawless corners of the West, they were part of the culture of intimidation. In towns where fights often started with fists before guns, the knuckle duster revolver was a natural fit. Collectors today prize them as curiosities, not for their power, but for their odd design. They remind us that frontier weapons weren't always about precision or elegance. Sometimes they were just about raw intimidation. Would you rather face a revolver or a pair of brass knuckles with a revolver attached? Either way, it wasn't a fight you'd want to pick. And while this weapon thrived in saloons, number 9 was built for surprise, a pistol that gamblers could literally pull from their sleeve. Number 9, sleeve guns, the trickster's draw. This was the sleeve gun, sometimes called the trickster's draw. It wasn't one single model, but a category of concealed pistols mounted on spring-loaded mechanisms that could slide out from under a coat sleeve into the user's hand. The idea was simple. Hide a tiny derringer or pocket revolver under the sleeve attached to a sliding rig. With a flick of the wrist or by pressing a hidden release, the pistol would drop into the palm, ready to fire. In theory, it gave a gambler or outlaw the element of surprise, a hidden ace in a saloon confrontation. Most surviving examples were 19th century curios, often improvised or custom-made rather than factory standard. The concept became famous later thanks to Hollywood, especially gangster and spy films, but it had roots in the Victorian obsession with disguised and concealed weapons. In the Wild West, sleeve guns weren't common, but they did exist. Tiny derringers and suicide specials could easily be fitted into sleeve rigs. The trade-off, of course, was reliability. Springs broke, pistols jammed, and drawing a gun from under your coat wasn't always as smooth as fiction makes it look. Still, the psychological effect was undeniable. A man might appear unarmed at a poker table, until with one sharp flick, a pistol was suddenly in his hand. In a world where appearances meant survival, that kind of trickery could make all the difference. Today, sleeve guns are more remembered as stage props than practical weapons. But they tell us something important about the frontier. It wasn't just about who had the fastest draw on Main Street. Sometimes it was about who had the most unexpected one. A gun hidden in your sleeve was dangerous. But number 8 shrank things down even further, creating a pistol so small it could disappear in the palm of your hand. Number 8, Palm Squeezer Revolver, the Suicide Special. This was the Palm Squeezer Revolver, also known as the Chicago Palm Protector. But gamblers on the frontier gave it a darker nickname, the Suicide Special. Unlike a normal revolver with a trigger, this pistol fired when you squeezed it in your palm. The barrel poked out between your fingers, while a squeeze of the grip rotated the cylinder and released a shot. It was tiny, small enough to hide in a vest pocket or to conceal completely in the hand. Most were chambered in .32 rimfire, and while they weren't powerful, they were perfect for up-close defense. At card tables, where distance didn't matter, that was all you needed. A gambler could sit with both hands on the table, apparently empty, while secretly clutching a fully loaded pistol. The Palm Squeezer design first appeared in the 1880s, produced by the Protector Palm Pistol Company in Chicago, and later manufactured in Europe as well. They were marketed to civilians, especially city dwellers, as discreet self-defense weapons. On the frontier, they quickly earned their sinister nickname. Because they were cheap and easy to hide, they were often associated with surprise killings or desperate last resorts. They weren't reliable dueling weapons, but they were terrifying if pulled suddenly at point-blank range. Hollywood rarely touches on these pistols, yet they capture a truth about the Old West. Not every fight was about quick draws on dusty streets. Sometimes it was about the weapon you never saw until it was pressed into your ribs. Today, collectors prize palm squeezer revolvers for their unique mechanism and rarity, but their lesson remains chilling. In the Wild West, even a handshake might conceal a loaded gun. And while the palm squeezer hid in the hand, number 7 hid in plain sight. Strapped around the waist, disguised as something no one expected. Number 7, belt buckle pistols. The quick draw waistline. Belt buckle pistols were some of the strangest concealed weapons of the 19th century, earning the nickname the quick draw waistline. At first glance, they looked like ordinary belt buckles, holding up a man's trousers like any other piece of hardware. But hidden inside was a tiny pistol, usually a single shot, designed to fire from the waist. Most of these oddities were European imports from the late 19th century, curiosities more than serious firearms. But a few found their way west, carried by gamblers, travelers, or anyone fascinated by the idea of a gun hidden in plain sight. In an era obsessed with creative concealment, the belt buckle gun was a novelty that blurred the line between fashion and firepower. Mechanically, they weren't very practical. Firing them required awkward movements, often exposing the user as much as the target. Accuracy was poor and reloading was slow. They were never military weapons, never outlaw standards. But they were real, and they terrified lawmakers who feared the potential for surprise attacks. In fact, some jurisdictions explicitly banned disguised pistols, with belt buckle guns among the examples. Their appeal, however, wasn't effectiveness. It was the element of surprise. Imagine facing a man who seemed unarmed, only for him to suddenly lean forward and a shot rang out from his belt buckle. Even if they weren't efficient, they carried a psychological weight that made them far more intimidating than their small size suggested. Today, belt buckle pistols are incredibly rare, mostly preserved in private collections or museums as curiosities of firearms history. They represent the extremes of Victorian ingenuity, proof that the obsession with hidden weapons had no limits. A gun disguised as a belt buckle might sound strange, but number 6 pushed the idea even further, blending a pistol with a blade in one deadly package. Number 6. Knife pistols, the blade that fired back. Knife pistols were hybrid weapons that blended two of the frontier's most iconic tools into one deadly package, earning the nickname the blade that fired back. On the surface, they looked like oversized Bowie knives with long steel blades and sturdy grips. But built into the hilt or handle was a single-shot pistol barrel, turning a blade into a firearm at the squeeze of a trigger. The idea wasn't entirely new. Knife pistols appeared in Europe earlier in the 19th century, and a handful were made in America as well. By the time of the Wild West, some Confederate officers had carried them during the Civil War, and examples trickled westward afterward. They were never common. More curiosity of gunsmithing than a weapon you'd see on every frontier street. But they existed, and their reputation grew thanks to their sheer intimidation factor. Imagine facing a man in a knife fight, only to realize too late that the weapon in his hand wasn't just a blade. At close range, a concealed pistol shot could be the end before the knife was even swung. That dual-purpose threat made the weapon terrifying, even if it was rare. In practice, knife pistols had major drawbacks. They were heavy, awkward to carry, and difficult to reload. You had one shot, maybe two if the design was more advanced, before you were back to using the blade. For this reason, they never replaced dedicated pistols or knives. But for the gambler or drifter who wanted something unusual and intimidating, the knife pistol filled that niche. Today, surviving examples are highly collectible, prized for their unusual craftsmanship and rarity. They stand as reminders of an era when gunsmiths experimented with almost anything, and when intimidation was sometimes as valuable as function. And if a blade that fired a bullet wasn't strange enough, number 5 returned to a simpler design. One of the most famous concealed pistols of the Wild West, carried by gamblers everywhere. Number 5, Remington Double Derringer, the gambler's favorite. The Remington Double Derringer was one of the most iconic pocket pistols of the 19th century, earning the nickname the gambler's favorite. Unlike oddities such as knife pistols or belt buckle guns, this weapon was practical, reliable, and actually common on the frontier. Introduced in 1866, the Remington Double Derringer featured two stacked barrels in an over-under design. A simple flip of the top allowed the user to load 2 cartridges, usually in .41 rimfire. A surprisingly powerful round for such a small pistol. With 2 quick shots and a compact frame, it became the go-to weapon for gamblers, ladies, and anyone who needed protection without wearing a heavy revolver on their hip. The genius of the design was its simplicity. Pull the trigger once and the top barrel fired, pull again and the bottom barrel discharged. That gave its owner a chance to fire twice in quick succession, often enough to escape a bad situation or deter an attacker. The double derringer's popularity lasted for decades. Remington kept it in production all the way into the 1930s, a testament to how much people trusted the design. On riverboats and mining camps and in smoky saloons, it was a weapon you could count on to hide easily and shoot when it mattered. Hollywood often skips over it in favor of Colt peacemakers, but the reality is that many ordinary men and women in the Wild West carried derringers like this one. Its compact size meant it fit inside a boot, vest pocket, or purse, and its 2 barrels meant it carried just enough firepower to be taken seriously. Today, collectors recognize the double derringer as one of the most successful concealed pistols of the 19th century. More than just a curiosity, it was a frontier workhorse, one of the rare hidden guns that was both deadly and dependable. And if 2 barrels were enough to make this a gambler's favorite, number 4 carried even darker fame. A single-shot pistol tied forever to one of the most infamous assassinations in American history. Number 4. Philadelphia Derringer. The gun that changed history. The Philadelphia Derringer was the pocket pistol everyone in the mid-19th century recognized. Tiny, concealable, and devastating at point-blank range. Which is exactly why it earned the grim distinction of being the weapon that changed a nation. Small, single-shot, and typically fired a .44 caliber ball, the Derringer was built to disappear in a vest or boot and to be used at close quarters when there was no time for a long draw. These pistols trace their name to the Philadelphia gunsmiths who first produced compact flintlock and percussion pistols in the early 1800s. By the 1850s and 60s, the Derringer style had become the ultimate gentleman's backup. Private, light, and easy to hide. You could slip one into a purse, a vest pocket, or even pin it inside clothing, which made it popular with gamblers, travelers, and anyone who wanted protection without the bulk of a revolver. The most infamous moment in the Derringer's history came on April 14, 1865, when John Wilkes Booth used a Philadelphia-style single-shot pistol to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The pistol Booth fired is preserved today at Ford's Theater National Historic Site. A sober, tangible reminder of how a small, concealable firearm could alter the course of history. That incident cemented the Derringer's reputation. Suddenly, this gambler's backup was also an instrument of political violence. But outside that dark chapter, the Derringer story is less sensational and more practical. It wasn't a duelist weapon, nor the tool of famous gunfighters. It was a private tool meant for emergencies. Its popularity came from reliability and concealability, not battlefield power. Because it required the user to be in extremely close range, its very effectiveness relied on surprise. The same principle that made so many hidden guns dangerous on frontier streets and in saloons. Collectors now prize original Philadelphia Derringers for their historical weight and craftsmanship. But on the frontier, they were simply common, quiet, and deadly if you found yourself within arm's reach of one. If the Philadelphia Derringer showed how a single unseen shot could change everything, the next gun on our list took concealment and everyday use and turned it into the great equalizer at the card table. Number 3. Classic Gambler's Derringer, the Great Equalizer. If there was one hidden gun that defined life on the frontier, it was the classic Derringer. So famous in saloon lore, it earned the nickname the Great Equalizer. Unlike the curiosities and oddities further down this list, Derringers were the weapon of choice for gamblers, con men, and ladies who wanted discreet protection in a world where danger lurked behind every poker hand. Small, single, or double-barreled, and usually chambered in calibers from 22 up to 41, these pistols could be tucked into a vest pocket, slipped into a lady's garter, or hidden in a boot. They weren't designed for long duels or for the open street. They were built for moments of desperation, when a man needed to turn the odds in his favor with one sudden shot. In smoky saloons across the West, gamblers lived by reputation, bravado, and bluffing. But when words and cards failed, the Derringer was the hidden ace. One moment, a gambler's hands rested casually on the felt. The next, a pistol was in his palm, pointed across the table. It wasn't about firepower, and it was about surprise and intimidation. That's what made it an equalizer. It gave a chance to someone who otherwise stood no chance at all. Derringers weren't rare, and they weren't novelties. They were mass-produced by companies like Remington and Colt, marketed specifically for civilians who wanted a discreet defense weapon. They were popular among women in particular, who often carried them in handbags or under clothing at a time when openly strapping on a Colt revolver wasn't socially acceptable. Hollywood sometimes gets this right. You'll often see a gambler whip out a derringer in a tense card game. But what films miss is just how common they were. In the West, almost everyone knew someone who carried one. Today, classic derringers remain iconic symbols of frontier life, not because they were the most powerful guns, but because they were the most practical hidden weapons. And while the gambler's derringer was an everyday equalizer, number 2 pushed concealment into the world of shadows, a revolver designed specifically for undercover work and assassins. Number 2, Overcoat pistols, the assassin's revolver. Overcoat pistols were the hidden weapons of the shadow world, earning the nickname the assassin's revolver. Unlike the flashy Colts worn openly on the hip, these small frame revolvers were designed to vanish inside clothing, tucked into the lining of an overcoat, hidden in a pocket, or strapped where no one would see them until it was far too late. They were typically short-barreled pocket revolvers, often chambered in 22, 32, or 38 calibers. Dozens of companies manufactured them in the late 19th century, from well-known firms like Colt and Smith and Wesson to countless small makers producing what became known as suicide specials. Cheap, compact, and easy to hide, they were marketed to ordinary civilians for self-defense. But they quickly gained a darker reputation. In the hands of gamblers, drifters, and especially hired guns, the Overcoat revolver became the perfect tool for ambushes or quick escapes. Unlike the bulky 6-shooter strapped to a gun belt, these pistols could be drawn quietly and used at arm's length, often before a victim realized a weapon was present. They weren't powerful at range, but at saloon distance they were deadly. Lawmen of the frontier understood their danger. Open carry was one thing. You could see trouble coming. But a man who appeared unarmed might have a revolver sewn into his coat. That unpredictability was terrifying, because it meant anyone on the street could be carrying in secret. Hollywood rarely highlights overcoat pistols, but their reality is undeniable. They were cheap enough that almost anyone could own one, and common enough that many were tossed aside when newer designs appeared. Collectors today group them with suicide specials, often undervalued, but their importance lies not in rarity. It lies in what they represent. On the frontier, the Overcoat pistol embodied the hidden threat of the everyday. It wasn't about fair duels or open challenges. It was about the sudden, secret pull of a trigger that no one saw coming. And that brings us to number 1, the most infamous of all hidden guns, feared not because it was rare or elegant, but because it was everywhere. Number 1, suicide specials, the gun everyone feared. At the very top of the list is not the rarest or the fanciest, but the most widespread concealed weapon of the 19th century. The cheap little revolvers known as suicide specials. These weren't made by Colt or Remington. Instead, they poured out of small factories across America from the 1870s onward, built quickly and sold cheaply, often for just a few dollars. Most were 5 or 6-shot revolvers chambered in 22, 32, or 38 rimfire. They were small enough to slip into a pocket, light enough to carry unnoticed, and common enough that almost anyone could get their hands on one. Unlike finely crafted Colts, suicide specials were rough. Their parts wore out quickly, their triggers were unreliable, and their barrels often shot off center. Yet they sold in the tens of thousands, marketed to civilians who wanted affordable protection in an unpredictable world. On the frontier, their presence was everywhere. A gambler might keep one as a last resort. A drifter might buy one in town as his only means of defense. Even townsfolk who never carried a full revolver sometimes had a suicide special tucked in a coat pocket. That sheer ubiquity gave them a reputation far beyond their quality. People feared them not because they were powerful, but because anyone, anywhere, might have one hidden away. Lawmen hated them for the same reason. You could spot a Colt peacemaker on a man's hip, but a suicide special vanished into clothing, waiting for a desperate moment. That unpredictability made them as feared as any big iron revolver. Collectors today often dismiss them as junk, and many surviving examples are in poor shape. But historically, they mattered more than their quality suggested. They represented the darker side of concealed carry, a reminder that in the Wild West, the scariest gun wasn't always the most accurate or the most expensive. It was the one you never saw until it was pressed against your ribs. And that's why suicide specials earned the #1 spot as the hidden gun everyone feared. Hidden guns weren't the ones that won legendary duels in dusty streets or echoed in Hollywood westerns. They were the backups, the surprises, the last resort weapons tucked into boots, sleeves, and pockets. And yet, in their own way, They defined the real Wild West, a place where survival often depended not on the biggest gun, but on the one nobody saw until it was too late. We've counted down 15 of the strangest, deadliest, and most ingenious concealed weapons of the frontier. From ring guns you could wear on your finger, to suicide specials that turned up in almost every saloon and mining town. Together they remind us that the Wild West wasn't just about six-shooters and Winchesters. It was about ingenuity, desperation, and the constant shadow of hidden danger. Now I want to hear from you. If you had to walk into a saloon in 1880 with only one of these hidden guns, which would you choose? The gambler's derringer, the palm squeezer, or the suicide special? Drop your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West history brought to life. We've got more myths to bust, more guns to uncover, and more stories Hollywood never told. Thanks for watching. And remember, in the Wild West, the gun you didn't see was often the one you had to fear the most.